Hello everybody, and welcome to another fantastic tutorial by Renderosity on Poser 11 and Poser Pro 11. I'm Mark Bremer and we'll be going with you through this tutorial. In this movie we'll be looking at ways to integrate the older Poser characters into Poser 11 and work with the new SuperFly render engine. Many of the textures and materials make that jump very well, some do not, and we'll look at how to deal with those. Now I must mention this is an advanced tutorial. If you're new to Poser, I would encourage you to check out the large selection of free tutorials here at Renderosity about working with Poser to learn the basics and finding your way around the program. In this series, or I should say this movie and the ones that follow, I'm not mentioning how I do all these shortcuts and jump around. I'm assuming you already know, and we look at some of the more advanced integration features of working with Poser and tool sets it has and other programs. Okay. So we're talking about working with legacy characters, and I have this ball on the stage. Why? It's because the SuperFly render engine functions a little bit differently. It's a full Raytrace engine, which means that for every light in the scene, and we can kind of see some of these things lighting up on the ball a little bit, the light emanates rays that the program keeps track of to kind of fake the way light works in the real world. So the light's over here to the right. It'll send an array of light. It hits the ball. It bounces off. One bounces towards the camera. It's a very great realistic way to create reflections and caustics, bounced light, all those types of things. But it's also very expensive in terms of processing power that you need to do it. So it wasn't until the last few years that ray tracing was actually a way you could consider working with 3D. There was a lot of brilliant hacks to do that, and Firefly has a little bit of ray tracing built into it, but the brilliant hacks I'm talking about are faking things with textures and making some very, very complex types of materials that you no longer need to do. So with that said, let's pop into the material room and let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. I have the Raytrace Preview engaged, and you can find that under the window down here, so that we can get a real-time view of what's going on, because the regular preview, it doesn't work so well when you're working with the SuperFly render engine. And of course, if we happen to pop over here to the Render tab, we can always choose our render engine right here. I'll leave it at SuperFly for now, so we get a little bit of a comparison in here. But quick render up of our scene if we want to do that. Let me render that, and there it is. Nothing too remarkable there. Now you'll notice here where we have got the nodes that we'll start plugging into and working. This is not new, but what is new is that we have more than one type of root node to work with. This now is a Poser surface node. Think of this as something you would always work with when working with characters. There are several other nodes. If we were to add a new one, there is a physical surface, which plays by some different game rules, and then there are cycles surface. And cycles is a rendering process borrowed from the good folks at Blender that's been integrated into Poser to give you a wide range of new effects you could never achieve before, and some automated functions that we'll cover in some upcoming movies. Cool, cool stuff. All right, anyhow, let's talk about reflection. I'm going to put in the stock old way reflections used to work, and we'll use a Wacro to do that so you don't have to watch me build it. I'll pop this out, and right at the top, add reflection. So the ball is selected. I'll click that, and auto-magically it adds all the nodes that we need to make it work. But I'm going to call your attention to something that shows you that not everything is right. This kind of teal line, this turquoise one that's connecting this spheric map node to the reflection node, it's dotted. It's not a solid line. This is the new visual cue that one of the nodes that's being connected is no longer needed in the SuperFly environment. Now, if you're going to render in Firefly, leave it set up just the way it is, because Firefly is expecting to see this. So we already did a Firefly render right there, no problem. If I switch to SuperFly and then we go ahead and re-render, we get a different look going on. You'll notice how it's much brighter. There's all sorts of other things going on. The takeaway from what I'm showing you is that if a texture material works when you're involved with the characters, don't touch it. Leave it alone. However, if you start coming across some general strangeness and things that don't look right, then you can start editing. And the way we edit now with SuperFly, really by and large, is to reduce the complexity of the materials, which is great. So what I'll do is simply disconnect this. And this is only if I was working with SuperFly and SuperFly alone. I could delete these other nodes and it wouldn't be a big deal. The beauty of the Poser surface node is that with both these checkboxes enabled, is that Poser is going to think about it and say, okay, when it encounters SuperFly, it's going to look for the root type of node that it needs. And let me do a little refresh here because that didn't refresh. We see the new render pop into place, and I'll do a render again, and look what's going to take place. We get a similar reflection without this added complexity. That's a very, very nice thing. So let's take this into the world of working with legacy characters now. I'll come over to Pose. We'll delete the sphere here. And let me open up our browser and come over to characters. And yeah, let's try Poser Originals because there's some winners in here. The businessman, everybody's favorite. I'm going to pop over to the face cam here. And from our render side, let's come over here to Firefly first. And I'll go ahead and do a render. What a beauty. We've got this kind of classic, 3D classic that is, look that is not too attractive to look at all. When you get back to this level of character, there's some real basic things to do to make it work well, not only in Firefly, but to kind of supercharge it a little bit for working with SuperFly. So let's come back over here to, well, the preview area. Actually, let's just hop into the materials room. We are in the face cam right now, and because of that, let's see. Yeah, it didn't grab the face texture. So let's make sure we choose skin. There we go. And we've got some basic textures here. The color texture, which has the texture map applied to, gosh, this is about as rudimentary as you can get. But hey, it's a 10-year-old character. Give the guy a break, huh? And then we also have a color texture that's plugging into the diffuse area. So we're looking at the skin, and it's got one generic texture map for the entire character. How do we make this look better? Well, we pull off a trick that we have pulled off before when we worked with one of the new features, and that happens to be, I should say, newer features, skin subsurface scattering. This is still a very valid and fantastic node that's in here since Poser 9. This node was a little ahead of its time, but now it's fully integrated with the SuperFly rendering and ray tracing. So I just click this button. It does the heavy lifting for me, and now we've got everything in place. So in Firefly, if I go ahead and render out a new look, it calculates the subsurface a little bit. Yeah, it's a better look, a little more luminous. In fact, if we come back to the pose window, we'll notice when I do the render right here that we'll also need to possibly grab the lips, which aren't having any subsurface scattering going on because we get a weird little halo around them. Okay, well, that's fixable. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time fixing this guy up, but he's looking better. Now, I've had a number of movies, several of them, that says there's ways you can cheat, including the last one on SuperFly, to get some of that subsurface scattering where the eyes become a little more translucent and they kind of change color and turn red. The reason that doesn't happen automatically on many models, and this is a perfect example, is because for that to function successfully, the skin material has to be very, very thin on the ears, and typically it is not modeled that way. So even in SuperFly, there's still some times you might want to do some hacks like we did in the last tutorial, adding a different texture map to fake that, but that's one of the reasons we see it show up this way. Now, this character has lovely, lovely eyes. So let's go ahead and add a little reflection to that. And this is where we come into the whole idea of working with reflections for SuperFly versus Firefly. If I choose here for, let's go with eyeball. And what do we have to work with? We've got the eyeball, the iris, and the pupil. With the eyeball here, if we use that wacro and say, let's add some reflection. And it thinks about it, adds the nodes we need, and we've got that plugged in. I suspect it's a little too much. Yeah, maybe not. Let's do this render real quick. We'll let this do its thing and take a look at it. Not particularly luminous right now, and if we come back to, let's go to the iris here and use the same Wacro trick to save ourselves a little bit of time and render this up. Yeah, it's a little bit better. We start to see the color of the eye. There's some good stuff going on. Now let's change this to a SuperFly render. And at this little view, we're not going to see a whole lot there. We're going to see a tremendous change in how skin is rendered. But let's take this over. See, this is one case I'd mentioned in the previous movie where the Raytrace Preview does not always automatically auto-refresh, even though the checkbox is enabled. So you can click refresh and it does its thing and thinks about it, and yeah, a little more parity there. Let's go over to the pose room and take a look. I know you're going, why are you spending so much time on this old poser dork here? And it's because it's going to be a little easier for us to understand what's going on. As we get into our more advanced characters, that start to break in terms of reflectivity and working with the eyes. Cloth material does not seem to be a problem to the extent that anything that is reflective is. So, okay, we've got it set up here, and, well, we're going to have to tweak this to pick up the reflection from the lights in the room. So we can just come back to materials, and let me close up the Wacros here a little bit. Come back to, let's do the iris. And we only need the one reflection. It's still connected to the others. We see this dotted line again, which lets us know that as far as the SuperFly render engine goes, this is a unnecessary structure. We just need this reflection node right now. So this is, we would just simply have to change the angle and get some reflected elements in the room to see it. The construction of the character's face is kind of hiding the eyes from the other lights in the room. If I was to rotate around the character a little bit, let's see if we come to preview. Let me go to our posing camera maybe a little bit here. It thinks about it. Oh, print. We don't want to print. Give me a break. Posing camera. Let's make sure I get this where it needs to go. There. Now, if I come in here, we'll do a charming render here and see if we pick up some more reflections. Thinks about it for a second. Skin looks better. Yay for that. Really need to fix his lips. Looks like he's got, well, just doesn't look great. Yeah, we're starting to see a little more reflection right here. So know that we can come in and start working with characters. And, you know, it's your decision whether you want to take the extra time to do the subsurface scattering. Renders pretty fast here, so not a big deal. All right, let's come back to the regular camera here, the main camera, and get rid of this character. Let's start working with a more advanced character where we're going to start having some issues. Let's come over here, close up Poser Original, and come down to somebody like, oh, how about Simon? Go with Simon Casual. Click him into the scene here a little bit, and let's go back to our face cam. Now, for the render here, let's go with Firefly. And we're also going to be looking at skin textures with this one in addition to reflections. So we do our render right here. Simon renders up okay. Now, I'd mentioned that reflections are an issue when we start working with SuperFly. So let's look at how these things are built real quick in the material room before we do a render with SuperFly. Come over here, we'll choose body. Let's come down to eyeball left. Now again, this is the character's eyeball, so we're going to be looking over here on our right instead. And we can see that we've got image maps plugged in here. What is this image map? Well, it's two eyes. Oh, and I have to show you just because, well, it looks okay there. The SuperFly one, when we get the head down here, it's humorous sometimes when we work with that. Now we've got a bump for the eyes based off this, and we've got a diffuse color. Okay, you'll notice there's nothing in the reflection area. Well, where's this these highlights coming from then that are in there? Well, it's a nice little hack that's getting put in there by textures. So if we go to eye transparency left, we'll notice that we have an anisotropic shader that's plugged in there. It's a texture map that's in there. We can see it. Let's see. Well, it's just giving us that. It's not one we can load in there. So that's one way we're getting these items in here. What happens when I go to, how about iris left? We've got another anisotropic shader going on. It's the same item right there. But then when we come to the image map, we've got that in place. It's plugged into the bump here. And yeah, that's what's getting us these little spots on the eyes here. So you'll notice it has nothing to do with actual reflections. The reflections are zero or non-existent the full time. Okay, and if we come down to pupil left, nada. Nothing in there, it's just darkness. So how do we fix this or change this to get a little reflection in the scene? Well, we go ahead and let's come back to the eye itself, eyeball left. This is fine, we'll leave the bump in there, and all we need to do is to go ahead and add new node. And let's come down to Raytrace, since SuperFly is a Raytrace function, and choose Reflect. Now we can plug this in here to the reflection color. And this will be a pretty bright reflection. We can do a render. Now we're in the SuperFly mode right now. So if we come back to the Pros room and render, we're not going to see a huge difference right here at all. We still have the anisotropic items that are in here. But if I come here and switch this to SuperFly and we do a render, we start getting weird reflections all over the place, and this is because we just added reflection into the eyes right here. We need to go and dial that back and start modulating this on a very specific level. So one for the iris, one for the pupil, and one for the eyeball itself. Now the pupil doesn't have one because we checked that out, there's nothing in there, which means it's getting accepted by the default eye shader. That's a lot of talk, isn't it? Let's go in here and fix what I'm talking about. Let's come here to pupil left. We will add a new node and Raytrace, reflect. And this time we'll plug it into the reflection color area, but let's dial down the reflection color itself. So now we have a specific value in here that when we come back out here and do a render, it thinks for just a second. Yeah, not so much. We still need to dial that down. It's got a full 100%. So we'll come back in here. And this is really what it takes to go in and start working with each one of these, because we'll pop into another character and it's got some different, even more complex nodes that we need to simplify. So back to left iris. And I want left pupil, don't I? See how I am? Pupil left. All right, let's turn this down to something like 0.1. We can do a little refresh in here and see how that winds up. Darker. Now we'll come back to the pose room. And let's see our render set on SuperFly. Yes. Have to check these things just to make sure. Getting a little darker. So we need to start dialing down some of this reflection and fine tune it. This is where you're going to find the biggest issue is with the eyes. How about adding some actual bumps to it right here? Several ways we can do that. We can come into the materials room right here. And for the body itself, we'll probably want to come to head specifically right here. There's an image map in place. We know this, and this is the funny part of working with these image maps. What it tries to do is map this to a standard face right here. So if we were working with a body texture, it would try to map the body to the head. Yeah, I get cheap laughs that way. What can I say? Okay, an easy way to work with this, you might think, is to plug this texture map right into the bump value like we saw with the textures for the eyes. That's usually less successful because we can get much better renders than we used to be able to do. And a better way to go, in my opinion, is to plug the texture into the gradient bump channel right here. Now, we've got a couple things we can choose, and usually this is where you put in normal maps, but you can get away with putting color maps in here as well. If we do a refresh on this, see it think for just a second, we're getting some very dark types of skin in here. It looks like dirt. He kind of looks like a coal miner. That lets me know that maybe we want to change the method that it's working with right here. And I'm not going to spend the time and go back in and fine tune these. You don't need to see me tone those down, but what I would do is give them a value of like 0.4 for the eyes and work with it like that. Are getting some nice little bumps in the iris right there on the right side. But we've got darker textures on here. Maybe not what we want to do. If we come back to materials, we can change. We reselect head. We can go ahead and change the gradient mode from gradient bump to tangent space and see if that treats us a little better. This looks even darker. So a good thing to do here, if I was to go ahead and refresh this, and we'll see how dirty this guy gets. Yeah, very grungy, not a good idea. So let's come back to gradient bump, reduce the power of that to something more like 0.2. If we do a refresh on this, and we come in and take a quick look in the pose room and do a render, you know, personal taste, whether this is something you want to do. Notice that it's an easy way to kind of grunge up a character if you want to do that, if there's no specific bump map in place. So, yeah, quite possible. I'm going to go in and touch the eyes real quick and just say, let's dial that down. Eyeball left. We've got a value of full 1. Let me bring this down to 0.4 as I had mentioned. And let's try a render again. And that's looking a little better. Probably should have popped into the pose room to do that. Okay, you're getting the idea, right? Let's get ready to move on to a more advanced character and track that down. Still a little too aggressive. I think the eye is looking okay right here. We're picking up some nice reflections over here at the edge of the iris. But the iris I'd want to go in and dial back. Humor me for just a second. I kind of want to prove that this actually works a little bit. Iris left. And we don't have any reflection plugged in there. Well, let's do that, shall we? It's picking up the reflection off the eye, so we'll do reflect. Plug this in and give it a value of something like 0.2. Come back to our pose room and render this off. And we get to just play with it a little bit. Yeah, still a little too aggressive, but it can be dialed down very successfully. So know that this is something that just takes a little tweaking depending on the character. Okay, we're in here. Let's come back to our main camera, get rid of this guy, and get a newer but not the newest character. Again, the Paul and Pauline are totally fixed for the SuperFly render engine. So again, this is looking at just some of the legacy ones. Let's come over here and take a look at Roxy, perhaps. Roxy Casual. Or do we want Roxy? Who else do we have to choose from? You know, I don't remember when some of these things came out. It's in Casual. Yeah, we'll do with Roxy. Get the newest ones out here first. Roxy Casual. She looks happy, right? Okay. She loads in here. Maybe. As we go pull all the resources off the disk, I guess. There we go. And we pop into the face view. Our render is currently set to SuperFly. If I go to Firefly right here real quick, let's go ahead and render her up and see what she looks like with the Firefly render. And with the Roxy character, one of the reasons it's taking a while is that the subsurface scattering is built into her already. That was one of the characters that they customized for that subsurface scattering function. And I really can't tell you why this is taking so long. There we go, rendering the shadow maps. So how much of your life has been spent watching the poser spinning beach ball as a character comes in? Too much in my case. Okay. So we get this slightly frightening look here for the subsurface scattering, and then we get our character coming in. We'll focus on the eyes, and obviously this one is going to have the subsurface scattering already built into it, so the skin's looking okay. The renders you get straight out of the box in Firefly with Poser here are much better, in my opinion, than the 2014 version. They've tuned up the lights, things simply work better. So Roxy's looking pretty good here. Let's go ahead and switch to the SuperFly mode. Render one more time. Hopefully it'll happen just a little faster. And we won't go to full render. We will just make sure the eyes render up. This is where we're getting into the weird reflections in the eyes here that we're going to have to go fix. So let's go ahead and render up one of the little squares here and get a little more high resolution in there. Once we can see for sure what that looks like, we'll go investigate why this is happening. You'll notice while we're looking at it that the eye is very much shaped here. This is different than the eyes for the previous character we were working on, which had one texture that went all the way across. These are modeled differently and controlled differently with the textures. So yeah, we get a good sense of what's going on right there. Let's go ahead and cancel this and hop into the materials room. I know, Poser doesn't like being canceled in the middle of a render. All right, we're in our room right here. Our auto refresh. Hey, it's actually auto refreshing. How about that? Let's come over here to head, and instead let's do the same trick and look for left eyes. We happen to have cornea left, so let's take a look at that. It thinks about it, and yes, we have significantly more nodes plugged in. This is because as Poser was getting more sophisticated in renders, the elegant hacks they had to do with all these nodes to make it look good in Firefly are just much more complex than they need to be now with SuperFly. So this is a case where the render is not working okay and it needs to be adjusted because as the shaders are built, they aren't functioning well here. So the best thing to do is to go ahead and disengage some of these and only re-engage them if you need to. So I'll leave the bumps in there. That's probably okay. So let me collapse this. That's fine. The reflection color is a blender that's plugged into something else. We don't need to do that anymore if we don't want to. So what I'm going to do is disconnect, create a new node, Raytrace, Reflect. We'll plug that into our reflection color. And let's, it's currently at 0.7. Let me actually lower that down to something like 0.2. And then for this alternate specular, I think I'm just going to disconnect that. All right, we saw that change there in the eye. If I reconnect that here for alternate specular, watch the character's left eye in our preview here. We may want to leave that in. Oh, refresh for me already. Maybe a little too bright. Let's come here to the pose window here again and render this out in SuperFly. As a rule, the things I found that translate very well, many of the clothes still come in just fine. Hair seems to be doing all right too. But look at this, the cornea, oh gosh, still too bright, right? So let's go ahead and cancel this thing. Come back to materials. And this is where we're getting a discrepancy between preview and actual render. Let's go to cornea left. I'm going to disengage blend. There's our reflect, that's where it was, okay. So that's great for the cornea. 0.2, let's come over here to left iris. I hope you see me doing this periodically and go, gosh, I'm not the only one that that happens to. All right, let's plug this reflect in here and we'll give this a value also of about 0.2. And we've got a pupil over here, if I'm not mistaken, pupil left. Alternate diffuse, I'm going to disconnect. And let's go ahead and add new node, Raytrace reflection again. And I could have copied and pasted that to reflection node, but right clicking is just about as fast. So I'll come back to 0.1. Now we'll do a refresh here and see if our little window gives us a hint of the success of that. And it's looking a little more reasonable. Let's go over to the pose window and render this out. Thanks for just a second, and here we go. Much better. Now we can still go in and start messing around with it a little bit. We can plug in the alternate specular if we want, but we're getting a much more successful reflection that is actually reflecting what is in the room instead of faking it with texture maps or doing some environmental mapping. So this is some of the ways to consider approaching working with textures inside of SuperFly with older characters. The first thing is that suspect that any reflected surface, which can be tongue, teeth, eyes, is going to need adjustment. The second is that if the texture is working, don't necessarily try to simplify it. The program is designed to go ahead and deselect things from the Firefly that it doesn't really need and only render out what it needs for SuperFly. If you're building exclusive SuperFly textures, you can do them much more simply and far less complexly than they needed to be for Firefly itself. So this is some of the ways you can start working with old Poser characters like the legacy characters all the way up to the new ones, and then the Paul and Pauline characters. They played great with SuperFly. Have some fun.